Welcome everybody to the interview with VIT today. We have with us today Major General Harsha Kakar. He was commissioned into the army in June 1979 and superannuated in March 2015. During his military service, he held a variety of appointments in every part of the country, including Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast. The officer was the head of department in strategic studies at the College of Defense Management, where he wrote extensively on futuristic planning and enhancing joint operations. He served as part of the United Nations peacekeeping operations in Mozambique, and post his superannuation, he has settled in Lucknow, where he actively writes for two newspapers, The Statesman and The Excelsior of Jammu and Kashmir, and for the online newsletters, The Wire and Quint. Sir, it's an honor to have you on board.
My pleasure. Of course, I don't write for The Wire and Quint anymore. Now I go in more for the Center for Joint Warfare Studies, USI, and the others, because these were the two that I felt in the long term wouldn't be too ideal on account of their particular line of thought. So I've stopped for them for almost now about 3 years.
Oh, okay. So with that, we'll delve into the first question.
Right.
In your recent article about India-China relations, you often talk about China playing the role of a major antagonist. However, the common perception on an international stage is their flamboyant usage of their non-interventionist policy. How are these two doctrines at odds? And in your opinion, is the latter just a farce that China wields as a shield?
Okay, let me start. Actually, the current trend of China began with Deng Xiaoping, who led China from 78 to 89. His famous quote, which is still being considered as a basis for China to look forward, has been keep a low profile, hide our capabilities and bide our time. Now, from the time, in fact, and it was during his time that the Tiananmen Square incident came through, wherein there were thousands who were massacred. But the interesting part of it is this incident of Tiananmen Square doesn't exist in the history books of China. So as far as the current Chinese generation is concerned, you'll be surprised. If you question them, they would never have heard of the word Tiananmen Square incident. So that's the way things have moved in the country. Now, from the time Xi came in, there's been a change in the Chinese outlook. He twisted the philosophy of Deng, and he went back to and he modified it a little bit in the sense that China would stick to its path of peaceful development, but never give up its legitimate rights and sacrifice its core national interests. Now, this led China into a more assertive role. Before I come down to the antagonist part, we need to understand this part. And you find that the assertive role actually began from the time he took control as president for life in March 2018. Now, this assertive role, you see that as far as it deals with Taiwan, you see that in the South and East China Sea. Xinjiang, the way he suddenly went about trying to change the entire population there, the concept of how he's going to deal with the Uyghur uprising. You find the latest claims against Bhutan, India. It's also now raising its eyes towards Russia. So there's been a change in China, which was at one time peaceful. It is now moving towards making claims on areas which were really not considered China's own. Now, in addition, if you look at the way China has been in recent times, all its diplomats, it leaves them in places for a fairly long time. The diplomat in the ambassador in UK has been there for 10 years. Now, if you notice, there have been complaints coming in from a number of countries in recent times because of China. US has been complaining of China spending billions in its media to win over. It's been buying political support there. Australia, there have been incidents of Australian politicians being heckled for being pro-China, basically because of benefits that China has been providing them. You find the same complaint coming from other parts of Europe. And possibly also you would find it happening in India. Now in Taiwan, China was backing the current opposition. But when the re-election took place in January this year, and the president won with a record margin, China realized that its internal interference is not succeeding. It's done the same in Hong Kong. So the Chinese policy which is there has now become more towards changing mindsets in countries where it has an interest, whether the interest is economic, whether the interest is political. So that's sort of a change that you're coming across. And this sort of a change which China is now pushing through is where it is now showing its true colors, because now there's no one to challenge. The fact is, post COVID-19, now within China, there is sort of an understanding between the government and the people. Because it's a communist country, so the unwritten understanding between the government and the people is, we will keep improving your standard of living. Do not interfere in what the CCP does. But that is exactly what the CCP has now begun doing. It's refusing to accept internal dissent. It's begun dominating countries around the region, pushing its weight far more than what is required, clearly indicating to the world as of today that as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, the US has no role. Neither will the US come to aid any country in the Indo-Pacific. It is China. Please toe our line. If you don't toe our line, you're going to face questions. So this sort of a change which is being pushed in by China is what is adding to problems globally, which is why you're finding that nations are now uniting. ASEAN with China had managed to break by getting Cambodia onto its side. It had made Philippines almost cancel its agreement with the US. All of them are now reverting back. The reason is because they've realized that the Chinese desire to control from within is what is causing a major problem as far as handling China is concerned. If you have any questions that you wish to ask on whatever I've said, you're most welcome. We can discuss it further. There's no problem.
All right, sir. So while we do recognize China to be this sort of antagonist and trying to interfere in other countries or change mindsets in other countries, in another article of yours, and here I'll quote, the political slugfest within India is not about China invading Indian territory, but questioning the government for its comments and actions. So do you think that the political conflict that occurs in a multi-party democracy like India is one of the root causes for a country like China to actually have carried out such an incursion into our territorial borders?
Okay, now in a democracy, there is a desire for freedom for political parties, freedom for the press. The intention is to create an environment where everyone can comment and criticize. Now, at times, the freedom has gone a little bit, beyond the levels where it is. Let's take a few examples. First, let's take Mumbai. Now, when Mumbai occurred, the government came in for severe criticism. Whichever was the government then, whoever was the opposition, the intention was to let down the government for its inactions. Now, a change of government took place in 14. Pathankot occurred. Now, the government then came in for severe criticism. Okay, then was Uri, then was Pulwama. Now, in all the cases, yes, there is no doubt that the government actions need to be questioned, and the government needs to provide the answers. Now, what happened after that? Which is why the present trend gets linked. After Uri, you had a strike across the border. After Pulwama, you had Balakot. Now, these two incidents were exploited by the government in power for political benefits. Now, there is no doubt that the government in power is the one which has taken the decision, put its neck on the line when it took a decision to go across. The incident could have escalated. There could have been a failure with large number of casualties, all of which would have put the government in power at a disadvantage politically. Now, nothing happened because of the capabilities and the planning and the implementation by the armed forces. Now, a government in power can take credit for its decision. But when you take credit for the implementation of the decision, you are going to irk the opposition, which is very, very logical and which is exactly what happened. It is possibly these two incidents, possibly. I mean, I would include many other factors into it, which played a role in the government coming back in the way it did. So you actually created a political environment within the country. Secondly, when you look at the current incident, now, whenever there's a major incident with China, whether it is Doklam, before that it was Delchok in 2013, where again the government, which was then in power, was criticized by the same people who are now defending their actions. So this has been a regular political slugfest. Now, whenever there's an incident with China, there's an unwritten ruling that while you take a decision to resolve the incident, you avoid making political comments which can aggravate the scenario. So when the political slugfest builds up, the government, whichever was in power, whether it's 2013, 2017, 2020, the government maintained a steadied silence with minimum comments. Now, what happens if you're sitting on the Chinese side? Okay, when you see an internal rift within, you seek to enhance the rift. Now, when you seek to enhance the rift, you put the government in chair under pressure, hoping to get them to come to a level where you raise the level of talks. Now, you've got to realize, if you're monitoring the news as of date currently, the resolution to de-escalate has come between talks between the two special representatives for border issues, the National Security Advisor and the Special Representative and Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi. Now, the question was who would blink and go to this level first. So when the pressure tends to mount to the government, on the government, and the government is then compelled to possibly go in for a solution at a far earlier stage, then it would be India blinking. Whereas in this case, the government, despite all pressures, maintained a steadied silence, and it let the issue to come from the other side. So a political disharmony within the nation creates an environment for the opposition or for the adversary to exploit the situation. China sat down for over 2 months, letting the discord build, hoping the discord would apply or lead to requisite pressure. In one form, we had no elections in this period of 2 months, but otherwise it would have had an impact because the government would have come under pressure. So whenever there is an internal discord, you're always playing into the hands of an adversary. That is exactly what I say. But when there is national unity, when political parties stand together, like it happened during Kargil, and you stand together and criticize the adversary, it is a national strength or a national unity which you show, which has an impact when you're dealing with such situations.
So as a follow-up to this, another principle that we usually follow when it comes to national security issues or border conflicts is that the prime minister or somebody from the leading party usually holds a political parties meet to inform all the opposition parties of the situation and how to comment, etc. Right?
Exactly.
But what we've seen in this particular conflict is that that meeting seems to have gone awry, right? Because we've seen the opposition make multiple comments about how the government has dealt with the China case in criticizing them about how China has been allowed to defend their stance, etc. Right? So, do you think that this opposition, this political parties meet is actually one of the most key principles that we need to show national unity, or do you think that it's just extra and it's okay if the government shows solidarity as long as the opposition parties are still allowed to criticize the sitting party?
See, the all-party meet is essential. Here, when you took the all-party meet, you took it after Galwan. That is when you took it. That, in my opinion, is late. You could have taken it far earlier, got them into picture, explained what was happening, rather than wait all the way for a major incident to have occurred to have called in the all-party meet. Now, when you called the all-party meet after Galwan, you conveyed a message that the incident is severe, it has impacted the Indian political space, and therefore the government is called the all-party meet. Logically, had you called it before, had you explained the scenario, had you given the way you're going to handle it, the question is the criticism would have still remained because India is a democracy. There is always a question for power, whether it's at the center of the state. But at least the government would have been on a better footing saying, look, we've discussed it with you and this is what we're going ahead. But calling it after Galwan, I think was a stage late. It should have been done much before.
So a slight follow-up to that. So
Yeah.
if I draw a parallel to the United States, where any military action, if not taken by presidential order, usually is talked with both the Republicans and the Democracies, or the those who have the House and those who don't.
Correct.
So what happens there is you often see that in order for any such military action to actually go ahead, or any sort of decision to be made, there's a lot of rendering, right? There's a lot of process before it actually happens. So if you draw that parallel to India and you take the decision that the current government made and the idea to have the political party meet after the decision or whatever carried out, don't you think it's better to follow the way we do it, because the way we did it this time, considering the democracy that India is?
See, in our case, you had the meeting after you lost 20 people at Galwan, right? Which indicated that you are holding it after a major incident has occurred. Till then, you were attempting to display that there is nothing very major. Whereas even after the incident and till date, you've accepted that it is a major incident and is being handled at a very high level. I mean, the two special representatives are very high levels of political contact. The next above that would be the Prime Minister and Xi Jinping, which hopefully will not come to that. So when you've handled it at this level, so this is where you should have done this earlier, put them in picture, reduce the rhetoric within the country. Because today when you find on social media what is flowing, which impacts the human mindset or the national mindset, is split not because of China having come in. It's split because of political leanings. Now, when I try and explain this issue on social media, those who are anti the ruling party in the center are unwilling to accept, even though they have no clue of understanding of what is the line of actual control. They have no clue of understanding what are fingers. And they have no clue of understanding what are patrol points. Okay, so without a clue, but just because of your political leaning, you are creating an environment of discord. Whereas it should have been creating an environment of unity. It automatically changed after Galwan to a large extent that even those who were anti started changing because of loss of lives. So that incident brought about a change. But the initial feeling was that the government is hiding reality. The government is not coming out with the truth. Now, even if you had not shared it in the public domain, which you're not supposed to share because a lot of things are being handled at the diplomatic and the military level, but definitely the political party leaders, since they also have an oath to the constitution, could have been brought into picture, and this sort of a discord which was flowing through would have been avoided.
Right. So with that, we'll move on to the next line of questioning.
Yeah.
So you also talk about an economic war being the new front. So for India, the troubles with our neighbors are more complex, while the Chinese government continues to provide huge amounts of loans to these countries for economic, trade, and commerce purposes. And these countries then become an asset to China. If these countries fail to pay back, the Chinese government can grab their offshore lands and ports of these developing countries through its debt trap diplomacy. Now, considering these tactful games that China is playing, what do you think is the right step that should be taken from an Indian perspective?
There are already, firstly, let me put across the fact that when you look at taking over assets, you've taken over the Hambantota port for 99 years in Sri Lanka. You would I think they've also taken over a port in Kenya at Mombasa, or they're in the process of looking at it. You're looking at taking over an odd other assets within Africa. As far as the Gwadar port is concerned, as per the agreement, it's already on lease with them for 40 odd years. Now, when you take over the asset and there are still no ships coming into Hambantota, so what have you done? You've taken over a strategic asset which can be employed by you or utilized by you in case of an operation. But is it giving you back the returns with which you invested? That's the first part that you need to recollect. Now, the money has been sunk in. Now, as far as India is concerned, what has India been doing and what has the rest of the world been doing to deal with China's BRI? Now, China's BRI, by the way, though announced in 2013, it's the Chinese version of the Marshall Plan of the US, which the US announced post the Second World War for rebuilding Europe. They've modified it. The difference being that any project that, in fact, they would first look at projects which are worthless, or any project that the country wants to start. And basically, in most democracies where the economy is not good, the leaders look for projects to indicate development without caring a damn as to how the repayment will be done later. So that is how nations get sucked into projects which at the end of the day are not forthcoming. Now, India has been offering loans. It cannot match the Chinese economy. There's a difference of 5 times the Chinese economy. So it's been offering loans to countries. We've offered loans to Maldives to try and repay back part of China's loans. We've offered it to Sri Lanka. We're offering it within our neighborhood. Of course, you can't match what the Chinese are giving. India, Japan have joined together to what they've formed as a Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, PQI as they call it, where they're looking at, one of the projects that they're looking at is in Colombo. The second, they're looking at the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Simultaneously, the US with Japan, Australia, they were itching for India to come in. So far, India stayed out, is what they're terming as the Blue Dot Corridor, with major investment coming in from the US, partially from Japan, partially from Australia. And this was launched last year. The intention of this project basically is to counter the BRI. At the same time, India has been advising nations against going in for BRI and going in for the debt trap. Because the moment you get stuck into the BRI and the debt trap, I mean, people are now realizing. See the impact in the neighborhood. Today we talk of Nepal being pro-China. But there are no BRI projects in Nepal. Nepal is a member of BRI. The reason they've accepted projects, they're letting studies go, they're not letting studies conclude. They're not letting the project start. Why are you doing it? Because you know where the impact is. Myanmar, Malaysia. Okay, all of these countries have started reducing. Maldives, no more projects. Whatever they had, they've cancelled it. Because people have now begun realizing as to where are you landing. To a large extent, you've got nations like India and Japan which are willing to give you funds at far lower rates of interest or help arrange funds for you at far lower rates of interest. Because then when you take funds and you start a project, the labor is yours. The resources are yours. The repayment channels are far more easier. Look at the way things are today on BRI. The recent release from China itself, 1/5 of the projects are seriously affected. This is post the pandemic. 40% are adversely affected, and 30 to 40% are somewhat affected. See where the status is. Despite all that China has done, it's ultimately going to fall back. And where are the funds going to go? Today, the Chinese economy is possibly amongst the worst hit. They are way down. Their borrowings are way beyond their GDP. All their banks are lending out money. Repayments are not coming in. Industries are closing. So where are the funds ultimately going to come? How much are you going to keep reducing for your BRI? You cannot stop nations from going to China because that's the easiest manner to get loans. Interest rates are high. And in democracies where a government is in power for a few years, you're seeking to create that environment to come back to power. And that is where these impacts are coming.
Right. So just as a follow-up to this, something that you talked about in the beginning of your answer was that how it's not giving you the same economic return by capturing these or acquiring these assets that they did as a collateral from their loans. Sir, but don't you think that the return that they get is far beyond the economic return, and it's more of a political or a geopolitical statement, as well as the fact that China doesn't really have a lot of foreign military bases. So this is something new to them, and this seems like a more strategic way of acquiring military bases as compared to the model that US or the UK followed when they first initially acquired their military bases in foreign countries.
See, when you look at the Chinese acquisitions as of today, Djibouti is a military base for them. Gwadar will become a military base. There is no doubt. Hambantota may not become a military base. Okay. If it's a military base for you, it gives you the ability to place some amount of vessels, some amount of manpower. But look at the distance that you've got to transit, which is why India is not very concerned about these bases, because the basic replenishment is going to come all the way from China. Look at how long is your lines of communication. Which is why when we say that the Indian Ocean is not easy for any other nation to dominate, is because of our lines of communication. So the further that you are from your own base, further that you are from your, and the longer are your lines of communication, the more difficult it is for you to maintain your forces. How much are you going to deploy at Djibouti or Gwadar? 2 ships, 3 ships, with some amount of resources, with some amount of stocking. But where is your main base? Your main base is still going to be China. Now, on the contrary, okay, let me add, on the contrary, let's say India takes a call and you decide to open a base for the US in Andaman and Nicobar. Or you open a base for the Quad in Andaman and Nicobar. See the impact. Okay, here you are at a choke point. And sitting at the choke point. For us, of course, the problem comes that a large part of ours is impacted on account of the movement via Sri Lanka. So once the Sri Lankan government goes anti-India, yes, we may face a bit of a problem.
Right, sir. So since I think we only have around 10 minutes left, I'm going to be moving on to the next line of questioning. This is more about cyberspace being considered as the 5th dimension of warfare. And I'm going to take the example of the Pakistan's information warfare campaign. So considering what they've done using cyberspace, could you give us an insight to what a counter campaign by India would look like or should look like?
See, as far as Pakistan is concerned, you've got to realize that the army runs the country. They have a very well organized system of information warfare. The DGISPR officially hires interns, they're trained, and they're let out to operate. Most of it is monitored. If any of you who's been following me on Twitter, you would realize that I have a large number of Pakis on my list. All of them are DGISPR bots. You'll find 0, 1, 2 followers generally in their list, and you would find no retweet. You'll find the same coming in from the Chinese side. Chinese side, it gets more evident because in China, Twitter is banned. And they only have Weibo. But if the guy is tweeting and he's countering you and backing China, it means he's operating through some resource. And he'll give you a standard answer, I'm using VPN. Now, as far as India is concerned, it's a democracy. The moment you decide to go in for a system like this, you're going to come under political pressure. And that is going to add to problems because the first thing that's going to happen is that you are going to be challenged for using it for political gains. An ideal organization in India would be one which functions under the NSA. Why under the NSA? It will have not only the armed forces, but you can pull in people from all other streams, including from various other government organizations, which if you put him under the CDS or any of the armed forces institutions, you will never be able to build. But the moment he goes under the NSA, the first problem you're going to have is he's a political appointee. He's a chosen hand of the PM. So the next thing that will come is that this is being designed and played for by the Prime Minister. And it is being played for political purposes. But for us, the ideal organization, you should have one for China, which can get into the Weibo network using its own resources. And you should need to have one for Pak. Now, these are meant, and within the armed forces, you need to have the 3 services, a public information department. Today, you find that the Army PI is giving you some sort of questioning on fake inputs. It is mentioning that this is fake and it's issuing clarification, something it never did a year ago. So that slight change has come in. But it doesn't have a full-fledged organization to counter the fake media stories which are being spread across in social media. Today, social media is a means of warfare. Other than the Army, Navy, Air Force, you also have media warriors. And this media warriors, in fact, at one time when I was discussing it with the Army, I told them, one person with a laptop is far more effective in peacetime than a whole battalion of soldiers. Because he can change mindset not only within India but across. So we are now moving in. We've got organizations in, but these are not properly equipped, trained, officially coordinated organizations. That is the drawback. You've created cyber warfare cells. You have them existing all over, but you haven't put them together.
Right. So you talked about how this should sort of fall under the NSA, NSA ambit at least. So don't you think that the RAW may be a more suitable candidate for this because of the fact that one of the things we talk about is that the NSA is a political appointment, and I think that falls under that could be perceived political gains. The RAW is headed by civil servants. So don't you think that by putting it under that, it's a more independent organization and something that will have a little more resource as well as more power in order to deal with such actions?
I agree with you to some extent, but I just want to give you a clarification. RAW also functions under the NSA. So when you say it's under the NSA, he's got multiple channels. All intelligence agencies are under it. So when he's dealing with it, whom he wishes to put in is a different ballgame. Because ultimately it's going to come onto the NSA. Okay, so all the intelligence agencies are all responsible directly to the NSA.
Right, but my point was more towards the running of the organization itself.
Agreed. But ultimately, I said the final story will come there. But then that's very logical. It could go down to either RAW, it could go down to the Defense Intelligence Agency, one of the central intelligence agencies.
So taking into account what you just told us slightly before, to what extent do you think that we should be following military independence in decision making as compared to government interference in its day-to-day operations and on-ground functioning? Because that communication is often very, very effective during wartime.
See, as far as the functioning is concerned, in a democracy, the armed forces are meant to function under the government. Now, the dispute that remains is between political control and bureaucratic control. Basically, what we look at is political control. On ground, it was functioning till now, or will continue to function partially under bureaucratic control, which is where there is a big drawback. That is one part. Now, the government takes a decision to employ or not to employ the armed forces, whether it be for internal security, whether it be to deal with a national calamity, whether it be to deal with a threat from across the border. The level of employment of force, the nature of force, the planning and the execution is within the hands of the armed forces. You may to an extent brief the polity in terms of the broad strategic plan, but the ultimate decision of what to employ, the nature of force level to be employed, and the manner it is to be employed will always remain within the armed forces, because this is the only service today in the nation where there is no lateral intake. It is for you to head the service, you have to begin from the grassroots. So therefore, there can be no question of anyone from the political sphere dictating to you the manner in which you're going to operate. But the decision to involve you is up to them. So this is the difference that comes in.
Right. Sir, so considering that we have only 2 minutes left, just a sort of ending note, do you have any general message for the students of our college? Because we are a university editorial. So any final words for the youth who are maybe interested in joining the armed services or any of these fields?
You must remember, every child amongst his first toys is a gun or a rifle. And there's no child who hasn't played with a tank. Somewhere as he grows up, there is a slight disconnect. But you've got to realize that the army is a calling. It's a desire from within to join. It's not anyone who can push you in to join. It's not a career. If you take it as a career, you may lose. But if you take it as a calling, it will always be success. You got to realize that once you wear the uniform, you will be loved, you will be hated, you will be respected, you will be looked up with awe, and you will be considered with disdain, all almost simultaneously. It's a profession where the moment you wear the uniform, you feel the pride within yourself. You walk differently. You can make out a person who's worn the uniform in the manner in which he walks. The organization is a family. You join it once and it is with you till your last day in life. The bonding in Bonhami makes you cry at times. I commanded my unit. I left my unit after command in 2002. Even today, whenever a Jawan who served under me, his child gets married, he gives me a call to seek blessings. He goes to buy a car. The first thing he'll post is a photograph of the car to me, again seeking blessings. This is the sort of life and the bonding and the bonhomie that we've created within the organization. It's not something which anyone can take away from you, no matter what it is. That sort of a life, it's a life to cherish. In fact, it's only given to those select few who make it through the system, who go through the selection process. It's a 5-day selection process. No other organization gives it to you. If you look now today on social media, 21st anniversary of Kargil. Today, if you're looking at the period now, we're running into the 21st anniversary of the Kargil war. And if you look at the heroes of those days, they're all household names. They were the ones who had a calling, and that is the sort of reputation that flows through. Because when you are with your men, you live, eat, work with them. That sort of a following of a leader, you will not get anywhere. And what I want to say at the end is this is possibly the only organization in the world where every man is a leader. You train leaders, you lead leaders. And if you have that sort of a calling, it's only then that you will come in. And that is the important part of the service.
Right. Sir, so before we just conclude the interview itself, could you just share some short story about your posting? Any of your interesting incident that's happened in any of your posting?
Okay. Let me give you, you want something in the lighter note or you want something on a more serious
sir,
note?
anything up to you. Anything. Just 2 to 3 minutes of
okay.
Any incident that sticks with you.
Okay. All right. Let me take it something on the lighter note and a factual one. 2001, when we had the parliament attack, the armed forces mobilized. And when we did so, it was around middle of around 20th of December. I had an officer who belonged to Hyderabad. He's getting married to a girl who also was from the same city, but she was settled in Canada, yet to become a Canadian citizen. The marriage was fixed for 25th of December. So I got a message saying that all leave cancelled, everyone to revert back. But since he was getting married on 25th of December, I left a message. I said, let these guys get married. I was commanding the unit there. And after marriage, and we were in the northeast. Now, from the northeast to move to the western sector, especially if you're deployed against the Chinese in a very sensitive area called Balong. If you've heard about that area, that is where a major 62 war took place, and that's a known ingress route for the Chinese. There's no way you're going to move out. So I left a message saying that let him get married, and immediately after marriage, ask him to come down with his wife to Balong. He can stay there for a few days, and then she goes back to Canada. So while he was to come, the officers in the unit decided we must do something so that it remains a memory in their life that they've come and joined us in Balong. So what we did was we packed his bags. His whole trunk was packed, everything of his was packed. Now from where we were located to the airport was a 2-day run. So we moved his stuff to where he had to halt for the night while moving in from the airport. And the officer who met him at the airport happily drove them there. And when he landed there and he saw his trunk, he asked, why is my trunk come? So he was given a fake posting order saying that you've been posted to Kargil. You are to move immediately in the next 3 days. she can come and stay with us for the time that she's going to be in India, and we'll see them off. They were staying with a course mate of mine who was also commanding a unit. You can imagine the status of a lady married for just about 72 hours. She gets a message that her husband is to go to Kargil and posting. She's heard of Kargil, so that's why we chose the name. Next day morning, I was to join them for breakfast, and they were to come back, and I was to go ahead. When I landed there in the morning, I realized that the whole night the couple had not slept for a minute. Possibly both their faces were swollen. Evidently, there'd been a lot of fighting and crying the whole night. And when we landed up for breakfast, the guy who was the host, he had laid out a massive breakfast and everything, whatever you could in the environment, in the middle of an insurgency environment. I joined them on the same table, he, me, and the couple, and he kept telling me, he says, what sort of a bloody CEO are you? You could have at least delayed it by 3 months, at least they could have lived for some time. What nonsense are you after? Midway through breakfast, when they were not eating anything, the couple, after all, they've gone through a tough night, I told her, I said, this whole story is fake. You just pulled it. You can imagine the way they both flowed. And that was in 2002. 2006, I went to Canada on a course. Those days, we still did not have WhatsApp and the rest. So I sent him a mail saying that this is where I'll be in Canada. How far am I from you and which city are you in? It happened to be just one subway station apart. So within the first few days of landing, I went down to that place. And till date, whenever we've met, her statement has been, I can forget anything in life, but I can't forget the way you were sick. Because that sort of an incident has been embedded in memory and will remain with us lifelong.
Right. Thank you so much for that, for sharing that story with us. And thank you so much for joining us as well. It's been a very insightful discussion that we've had.
It's totally my pleasure.
So with that, we'll come to the end of the interview. Again, thank you so much for being here and for all of the insights that you've given us.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and I'm happy that you all have gained something out of it, and I hope you all will gain more with more reading with time to come. Thank you.